Hanoi disappeared. With the Paris Accords, Nixon had brought his country to an outcome that merged honor and geopolitics, even though it was later overwhelmed by domestic disaster. In August 1974, he resigned from the presidency. 8 months later, Saigon fell to an invasion by the entire North Vietnamese armed forces, including all combat divisions. Aside from the U.S., none of the 9 international guarantors of the agreement so much as protested. The Vietnam War initiated an internal division of American society that has torn it to this day. The conflict introduced a style of public debate increasingly conducted less over substance than over political motives and identities. Anger has replaced dialogue as a way to carry out disputes, and disagreement has become a clash of cultures. In the process, Americans have stood in danger of forgetting that societies become great not by factional triumphs or the destruction of domestic adversaries, not by victories over each other, but by common purpose and reconciliation. Great power diplomacy and arms control. Nixon's significance as a statesman derives from his fundamentally geostrategic approach. Following his early 1969 trip to Europe, he began a diplomatic offensive to weaken Moscow's control over its Eastern European satellites by drawing them individually into the orbit of American diplomacy. By August of that same year, having proposed a meeting with Nicolae Ceausescu, the autocratic leader of Romania, he became the first U.S. president to visit a member of the Warsaw Pact. So eager was Ceausescu for the symbolism of an American presidential presence, that he postponed the Communist Party Congress previously scheduled for Nixon's proposed date, and cancelled a visit by the Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev, who had planned to attend the Congress. Placards welcoming Brezhnev to Romania were taken down or painted over. Nixon was greeted by a rapturous public, partly stage, managed to advance Ceausescu's own effort to achieve autonomy within the Soviet orbit, but also reflecting the Romanian people's yearning for national freedom. As part of Nixon's entourage, I was the beneficiary of communist leadership luxuries, a large suite with an indoor swimming pool. Nixon encouraged these positive emotions in his toast, in public comments and, above all, in his conversations with Ceausescu. He also used Ceausescu as a means to open a dialogue with China by telling him of his interest in such a project. We found out 5 months later that this had been transmitted to Beijing, which occasionally thereafter used Romania, sparingly, as an alternative channel to Washington. Nixon's strategic goal was to increase the cost to the Soviets of maintaining their European empire, to the point where their continuing to do so would necessitate the diversion of funds and attention from other key objectives. In the course of his presidency, Nixon would visit additional Eastern European countries seeking autonomy from Moscow, including Yugoslavia in 1970 and Poland in 1972. When Willy Brandt became West Germany's first Social Democratic chancellor, the White House acquiesced to the outlines of Ostpolitik, his initiative intended to normalize relations with East Germany, the Soviet satellites and ultimately the Soviet Union. Nixon went along with this deviation from Adenauer's policy during the early days of the Brandt chancellorship while committing Brandt to the processes of Allied consultation. We sought to keep Ostpolitik compatible with NATO objectives and achieve leverage on Soviet designs. This strategy proved effective for both the United States and the Federal Republic. At the end of his first month as president and just before his trip to Europe, Nixon invited Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin to the Oval Office and conveyed his willingness to deal directly with Soviet leaders. A few days later, the president designated me as the principal channel for communications with the Soviet ambassador on sensitive issues. This arrangement established a pattern for the remainder of Nixon's term in office. Direct contact with Moscow was established through what was labeled the Channel, a Kissinger-Dobrynin conduit that ran from Nixon to the Soviet leadership. One of the principal topics turned out to be the impact of the two countries' vast stores of nuclear weapons on world order, and how to prevent a global catastrophe, either in preemption or in an escalating conflict between them. As vice president during the Eisenhower administration, Nixon had reflected on the impact of nuclear technology on strategy, considering both how to react to nuclear threats and how such fearsome weapons might theoretically be employed. He inherited the doctrine of massive retaliation, which based nuclear deterrence on the capacity to inflict damage believed to be unacceptable to an opponent. Subsequently modified to mutual assured destruction, this concept sought to reduce a paralyzing dilemma to a sober calculation on both sides of the risks of escalation. In practice, however, this theory, as a calculation of acceptable versus unacceptable destruction, implied the reckoning of casualties that, in a matter of hours, might exceed the total of the two world wars. Nixon once expressed to a journalist that executive leadership in the nuclear age required, among other qualities, a willingness to suggest one's readiness to perform irrational acts on behalf of the national interest. Although this statement was an instance of Nixon trying to impress an interlocutor rather than to convey an operational message, it nonetheless elicited intense criticism of his supposed recklessness. And yet in its essence it reflected a fundamental and enduring truth about the destructiveness in the hands of the nuclear powers. As we have seen in earlier chapters, Charles de Gaulle and Konrad Adenauer were both wary of basing their security on weapons in the hands of allies that offered no credible way to resolve conflict without cataclysmic destruction. Three questions had arisen regarding the use of nuclear arms. Was it possible to convince either an adversary or an ally of one's willingness to undertake a type of warfare likely to impair one's own civil order? Was it possible to introduce rational calculation into an ultimately irrational act? And was it possible to strike a balance between self-destruction and diplomacy? These dilemmas, arising nearly 80 years ago at the dawn of the nuclear age, have yet to be resolved. Since Nagasaki, no nuclear weapon has been detonated operationally. Even when engaged in conflicts with non-nuclear countries, nuclear powers have elected to suffer the casualties of conventional war rather than resorting to nuclear weapons to speed success. The examples of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, as well as the United States in Korea, Vietnam, and Iraq, all testify to this. Nixon understood that, by the time he took office, the American nuclear capacity was becoming controversial in the congressional appropriations procedure. He therefore appointed Melvin Laird as Secretary of Defense, who had served for a number of years as the chairman of the Defense Subcommittee of the House Appropriations Committee. Nixon was determined to prevent a situation in which an aggressor could mount a plausible strategic threat by developing a superior nuclear capacity. Laird helped shepherd through Congress Nixon's commitment to missile defense and his goal of greater variety in the design and capacity of strategic weapons. Laird also added to the flexibility and invulnerability of American strategic forces by developing cruise missiles and mobile land-based weapons. Second, Nixon took arms control seriously. The Test Ban Treaty, signed by Kennedy and Brezhnev in 1963, represented the first formal measure in nuclear arms control. For days after President Kennedy was assassinated, President Johnson proposed a resumption of strategic arms negotiations with the Soviet Union. The preliminary agenda-setting talks proved so inhibited by day-to-day controversies, however, that not until the summer of 1968, just before Nixon was elected, did both parties agree on terms to allow negotiations to begin. This planned summit was, however, abandoned following the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in August 1968. Thus, an early issue for Nixon became whether to proceed with arms control negotiations with the Soviet Union at all. The decision became symbolic for the larger direction of his administration. Applying linkage, Nixon would formally agree to open Strategic Arms Limitation talks, SALT, with the Soviets only after he had settled on a Vietnam strategy. U.S. accession to arms control negotiations, announced in October 1969, required the adaptation of existing administrative institutions. For the Pentagon, arms control was a novel subject. The department's emphasis had previously been on developing nuclear capabilities, not on restraining them. Arms control negotiations involving high-ranking military personnel, who were themselves only now being introduced to the subject, required novel command structures. Nixon's proposal, made early in his presidency, to build a 12-site missile defense system covering the entire country had also challenged the prevailing intellectual consensus that strategic equilibrium would be achieved via mutual assured destruction exclusively. A defensive initiative, critics charged, would undermine deterrence by eroding mutual vulnerability. This critique, as well as concerns over the program's cost and efficacy, led many in Congress to oppose it and seek to reduce its budget. On the other side of the Cold War, the Soviet Union harbored an elevated estimate of our emerging anti-ballistic missile (ABM) capacities and feared that American defenses would erode the Soviets' offensive capability. If, as a result of missile defense, America had less to fear from a Soviet second strike, the Soviets reasoned, the U.S. might be more likely to launch a surprise attack meant to disarm its adversary preemptively. The beginning of the SALT negotiations devolved into a stalemate over procedure and sequence. The Soviets argued for negotiating constraints on defensive weapons first, and only then turning to address offensive weapons. Nixon insisted on retaining the defensive option to provide the necessary pressure for negotiating offensive limitations, and to provide protection for our civilian population. The imminence of nuclear arms limitation negotiations produced a new set of domestic debates. The liberal consensus favored first the rapid opening of SALT negotiations, then their acceleration as a way of easing tensions. But now, as arms control was becoming established on the international agenda, an emerging combination of liberals and conservatives started to criticize them on the grounds that arms control dealt only with symptoms and not the underlying causes, the authoritarian nature of the communist system and its human rights violations. In addition, the characteristics of the opposing nuclear weapons systems complicated any workable definition of equilibrium. Soviet strategic systems were large and inaccurate, American weapons were more mobile and more accurate. That equilibrium would be disturbed if America added throw weight to its accuracy, or the Soviets magnified their throw weight with accuracy. After months of wrangling, Nixon intervened directly. Setting an initial goal of 4 defensive sites, on March 11, 1971, he dismissed the Soviet request for 0, and asked me to break the agenda deadlock on the relationship of defensive weapons to offensive weapons through private talks with Dobrynin. He did not disclose these talks, in part to forestall Congress from decimating the missile defense system during the interval and causing us to lose its bargaining value. Nixon's decision to inject himself sped up the negotiations. At the end of March 1971, I activated the Dobrynin channel, proposing on behalf of Nixon that both offensive and defensive limitations be negotiated simultaneously. The ensuing exchanges established a process, through negotiations conducted by Gerard Smith on the American side and Vladimir Semyonov on the Russian side in Vienna, that led to the SALT-I agreement concluded between Nixon and Brezhnev at the Moscow summit in May 1972. Though central in the design of the negotiations, Nixon took less interest in the details. At the beginning of each negotiating cycle, my staff and I would draw up a summary of internal deliberations, including projections of potential developments. Nixon would make marginal comments largely confined to general issues of principle. During negotiations, I would send him each evening a summary of where we stood. He would on the whole reserve his views for moments when a breakthrough was imminent. While technical discussions of weapons balances were unlikely to draw his attention, he was always crystal clear on his three principal objectives: to prevent an adversary from achieving a first strike capability, to avoid an automatic process of escalation in case of conflict, and to demonstrate to the American public his commitment to ending, or at least alleviating, the arms race. The Moscow summit resulted in the first comprehensive strategic arms control accords of the nuclear period. The agreements confined ballistic missile defense to 2 sites, ABM Treaty, limited the numbers of offensive strategic weapons to existing levels, SALT-I, and established ways of addressing incidents at sea and nuclear accidents. As a byproduct of these talks, the U.S., together with France and the U.K., took the lead in negotiations with the Soviet Union to generate a new agreement that would keep access to Berlin unchallenged, until the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. For the rest of his life, Nixon regarded arms control as an essential component of international order. And, in one form or another, substantive negotiations on the subject were conducted during every subsequent presidency until the Trump administration. The Ford administration, in 1975, completed the Helsinki Accords, whose negotiations had been started by Nixon, in which every European nation save Albania, together with the Soviet Union and America, agreed to common principles in security, economics, and human rights. The Carter administration would conclude the second SALT agreement, never ratified by the Senate though observed in its essentials. The Reagan administration would reach the only arms control agreement with the Soviet Union to eliminate an entire class of weapons, those of intermediate range. Finally, the George H. W. Bush administration negotiated the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, START-I, which led Washington and Moscow to reduce their strategic nuclear arsenals by nearly 60%, from a combined 48,000 warheads in 1991 to around 20,000 in 2001. What started as a novelty under Nixon became a commonplace after him. Emigration from the Soviet Union. When Nixon came into office, Jewish emigration from the USSR stood at only a few hundred per year. Nixon authorized me to put the issue to Dobrynin in practical, not ideological, terms. I told the Soviet ambassador that we were paying close attention to Soviet emigration practices. Soviet respect for our concerns would be reflected in our treatment of Soviet priorities. In other words, an improvement in conditions for Jewish emigration would further American cooperation. Dobrynin never offered a formal answer, but he agreed to discussions of specific hardship cases. By 1972, the end of Nixon's first term, annual Jewish emigration from the Soviet Union had reached more than 30,000. Nixon never claimed credit for this development in election campaigns or announced the increase in numbers. The Soviets never acknowledged it as an agreed-upon outcome. American domestic politics undermined this tacit arrangement. Senator Henry "Scoop" Jackson of Washington, a serious student of international affairs who as a Democrat had lent bipartisan bona fides to the Nixon administration's effort to sustain adequate defense spending, reframed the issue of Jewish emigration in ideological terms, arguing that the promotion of emigration should become a formal part of American diplomacy. He put forward an amendment to the Trade Act of 1974 conditioning U.S. trade relations with the Eastern Bloc on Soviet performance with respect to emigration. Thereafter, emigration took a steady downturn, decreasing from around 35,000 in 1973 to fewer than 15,000 by 1975. Nixon's objectives regarding Jewish emigration paralleled those of his successors, but his methods were more broad-ranging and more subtle, subordinating ideological confrontations to ad hoc practical arrangements. The opening to China. In 1967, Nixon, then out of office, published a path-breaking article in Foreign Affairs raising the possibility that China could not be left forever outside the family of nations. He framed the proposition in grand strategic terms, emphasizing the benefits to global peace if China could curtail its support for revolutionary insurgencies around the world, and one day be brought into diplomatic relationship with the West. Nixon's essay did not, however, define any specific way to achieve an eventual diplomatic opening. 2 years later, when Nixon became president, the opening became practical. China was then in the throes of the Cultural Revolution. As part of a grand scheme of ideological purification, Mao Zedong had recalled Chinese ambassadors from every country except Egypt. Though in a handful of countries, such as Poland, Chinese diplomats below the rank of ambassador remained. The first approach came from Nixon himself. During his visit to Romania in June 1969, as we have seen, he conveyed his intention to engage the Chinese through Ceausescu, who indicated that he would pass on the suggestion. No response was forthcoming, probably because the Chinese were fearful of Soviet penetration of a satellite country, even one as challengingly autonomous as Romania. During the 1954 Geneva Conference at the end of France's war to retain Vietnam, the Warsaw Embassy had been designated as a contact point between Washington and Beijing. In fact, 162 ambassadorial meetings had been conducted. They ended with each side rejecting the precondition of the other, the U.S. refusing to discuss the unconditional return of Taiwan to China, Beijing refusing to give an assurance of pursuing its objective only by peaceful means. Not even those pro forma meetings had taken place for several years. But in January 1970, we decided to activate the channel. I instructed Ambassador to Poland Walter Stossel to approach a Chinese diplomat at the next social occasion they both attended, with our offer of a dialogue. Assuming the instruction was a private initiative by me, Stossel ignored it, a symbol of rivalries between the White House and the State Department. Recalled for consultation, Stossel found himself in the Oval Office, where the president delivered his instructions personally. Thereupon Stossel presented the offer at a Yugoslav social function, where a Chinese diplomat first ran away from him but, when finally cornered, received our proposal. 2 weeks later, the Chinese ambassador to Poland appeared unannounced at the American embassy with instructions to begin a dialogue. 4 meetings took place. On the American side, progress ran up against the bureaucracy's formal system of clearances, first within the government and then with Congress, and Nixon at one point exclaimed, "They're going to kill this baby before it's born." In any case, soon after the American incursion into Cambodia in May 1970, The Chinese broke off the Warsaw Channel in protest. That October, however, Nixon repeated his interest in establishing direct contact to Yahya Khan, the Pakistani president, who had called on him at the White House in connection with a visit to the UN. This time, Nixon received a reply directly from Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai, writing on Mao's behalf. On December 9, 1970, in 4 cryptic sentences, Zhou elevated Nixon's conversation with Yahya Khan to the status of a formal message, characterizing it as the first time the U.S. had approached China on the presidential level, from a head through a head to a head. Zhou indicated that China was prepared to negotiate with the United States about Taiwan's return to the motherland. We replied, cryptically, that if dialogue were to proceed, each side should be free to raise issues of its own concern. Ensuing messages were sent back and forth without letterhead or signature to minimize the risk of disclosure and of a reaction in Moscow, and uncertainty in the rest of the world. In a return to historic diplomatic methods, the messages were delivered via messenger from Washington to the Pakistani capital of Islamabad, and thence by Pakistan to Beijing, with the Chinese replies following the same route in reverse. The pace of this exchange was slowed by both sides' determination not to permit their counterpart to exploit their respective eagerness, and to screen it to the maximum extent from the Kremlin. As a result, the dialogue between Nixon and Mao was conducted over a period of many weeks through my exchanges with Zhou, each time conveyed in a few sentences. A Soviet miscalculation helped speed the issue. During the spring of 1971, our secret exchanges were bearing fruit, and a visit by me to Beijing had been agreed. We were negotiating with both adversaries simultaneously on summits. Nixon solved the tactical dilemma by instructions to extend offers to both, starting with the Soviets. Were both to be accepted, we would take them in the order of their reply. I submitted our proposal for a summit to Dobrynin at Camp David in June 1971. The Soviets solved the problem for us by making acceptance dependent on our support in the negotiations, with the Federal Republic of Germany, Britain and France over a new Berlin Agreement. By contrast, during my secret visit to Beijing in July 1971, Zhou Enlai proposed a Nixon visit to China without any preconditions. 3 days after my return from China, Nixon accepted the Beijing invitation. Within a month, Dobrynin offered an unconditional invitation to Moscow. As planned, we placed it 3 months after the one envisaged for Beijing. The secret trip was arranged by scheduling a visit by me to Vietnam, Thailand, India, and Pakistan. Once in Islamabad, time for the final lap was found by announcing an indisposition that would explain my ensuing 2-day absence as a visit to a hill station for recovery. The entire process, from Nixon's conversation with Yahya Khan on October 25, 1970 to my arrival in Beijing on July 9, 1971, took 8 months. The actual trip, from the departure from Washington to the arrival in Beijing, took 8 days. Only 48 hours were spent in Beijing. How best to use that brief period? For the ambassadorial talks in Warsaw, the U.S. government had a well-established agenda. Items on the list included Taiwan, financial claims and assets arising from the expropriation of American property, prisoners and navigation in the South China Sea. But Nixon and I concluded that these incomparable topics were likely to lead into technical byways or ideological logjams that might obstruct progress toward the objective of a continuing relationship. I was instructed to express a willingness to discuss Taiwan, but specifically only in relation to the overall Chinese-American relationship with the end of the war in Vietnam. As part of this emphasis on geopolitics, Nixon delivered a speech in Kansas City, Missouri on July 6, 1971, while I was in transit. Elaborating his view of world order based on equilibrium among the great powers and omitting any reference to Taiwan, he said, "Instead of just America being number one in the world from an economic standpoint, the preeminent world power, and instead of there being just two superpowers, when we think in economic terms and economic potentialities, there are 5 great economic superpowers: the United States, Western Europe, the Soviet Union, mainland China, and, of course, Japan." The only agreement reached during the secret visit was an invitation for Nixon to visit China. Both sides concentrated on outlining their overall approach as a basis for further discussion. I elaborated on the Nixon speech. Zhou introduced a conversation with a quote from Mao: "There is turmoil under the heavens, but the situation is excellent." A more specific diplomatic dialogue opened during my second visit 3 months later in October 1971. The purpose was to prepare the summit and to draw up a communiqué for it. The 4-month interval between my second visit and the Nixon summit reflected our conviction that a deadlock between Nixon and Mao should not be risked in a first face-to-face meeting, where conversation would be limited by the domestic requirements of each side and the media waiting outside. I had brought with me a standard communiqué affirming our general intentions but lacking concreteness. Zhou returned the next morning with an explicit message from the chairman: "Having avoided high-level contact for so many years, our countries should not now pretend that we were approaching general harmony." Mao suggested that a full statement of our disagreements on specific issues be part of the communiqué together with some clearly stated agreements. In such a context, the communiqué would draw much more attention to the agreements rather than boilerplate declarations of goodwill. A shared statement regarding Taiwan's future was left to the principals at the upcoming summit, but, as a warning to the Soviet Union, Zhou and I settled on an agreement to jointly oppose hegemony in Asia. Beijing's sudden engagement was no doubt shaped by the pressure being exerted by the more than 40 Soviet armored divisions that were deployed along China's Manchurian and Xinjiang borders. High-level cooperation with China in establishing a global equilibrium would now be announced explicitly, and transform the nature of the Cold War. There was no precedent for the pre-summit draft that emerged, nor would there be any comparable successor to it. As had been decided, both sides expressed long lists of their disagreements, coupled with some statements of agreement. Each side made itself responsible for their own formulations. As neither of us asked for a veto over the other side, this approach gave us the opportunity to state the American views on Taiwan explicitly as part of a joint communiqué. The draft was then subject to the approval of Nixon and Mao. At the summit, Mao proved to be available for only 45 minutes, due, as we were later told by Chinese doctors, to a grave medical crisis the week before. But he had approved the October draft communiqué, which stated the full American position on Taiwan and other issues. In light of this, a statement that he then volunteered in his brief meeting with Nixon took on special significance. "China did not want Taiwan right away," he explained, "because the Taiwanese were a bunch of counter-revolutionaries. We can do without them for the time being, and let it come after 100 years. Removing urgency from the issue that had long thwarted negotiations between the two countries at the summit made possible a statement expressing what has remained the governing principle of U.S.-China relations for the 50 years since. The United States acknowledges that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain there is but one China and that Taiwan is a part of China. The United States government does not challenge that position. Following a formal proposal by Nixon at the summit, this language was added to what is now called the Shanghai Communiqué, which was issued at the end of his visit. Neither Nixon nor I invented this language. Instead, we drew it from a statement drafted during the Eisenhower administration in preparation for negotiations with Beijing that never happened. The statement had the virtue of accurately rendering the stated objectives of both Taipei and Beijing. Abandoning U.S. support of a two-China solution, the communiqué remained equivocal regarding which China would accomplish the postulated wishes of the Chinese people. After a few days, Zhou accepted our formulation. Its ambiguity freed both sides to conduct a policy of strategic cooperation that would tip the international equilibrium away from the Soviet Union. The statement implied that Taiwan would be treated as autonomous for the foreseeable future. Both sides would affirm the One China principle, while the U.S. would stop short of offering statements or actions implying a two-China outcome, and neither side would seek to impose its preference. The U.S. insistence on a peaceful solution was explicitly stated in the American section of the communiqué. Two additional communiques agreed during the Carter and Reagan administrations expanded upon these understandings. Together, they have remained the basis of relations across the Taiwan Strait. Were either side to challenge them, the risks of military confrontation would mount significantly. For 20 years following Nixon's visit, the United States and China conducted a broad-range collaborative policy to contain Soviet power. During this period, U.S.-China cooperation even extended to the intelligence field, albeit to a limited extent. Demonstrating the degree of China's commitment during a subsequent visit in February 1973, Mao urged me to balance my time in China with time devoted to Japan, lest the Japanese feel neglected and become less dedicated to the common defense against the Soviet Union. Rather than Japan having closer relations with the Soviet Union, Mao said, "We would rather that they would better their relations with you." The following month, Singaporean Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew used a lecture at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania as an occasion to reflect on the significance of the Nixon administration's diplomacy. "We live in stirring times. Not for some time has the world witnessed such dramatic changes in the relationship of the great powers as in the last 2 years. We are witnessing the shifts in the balance of power as the weighting has changed. And the great powers are learning to live peacefully with each other. The old fixed divisions of the Cold War appeared fluid and nebulous. Washington had moved from confrontation to negotiations with both Peking and Moscow. For whatever their different reasons, both communist powers wanted the war in Vietnam scaled down and America allowed to withdraw honorably. China, for her part, shows greater cordiality towards capitalist America and Japan than towards communist Russia. Ideological divisions appear to be less relevant. For the time being, national interests seem the most reliable guide for the actions and policies of governments. Nixon could have wished for no better appraisal of his policy. Mao died in 1976. 2 years later, Deng Xiaoping returned from his second purge and instituted the reform policy he had initiated in 1974 after returning from his first purge. From that point until the advent of the Trump administration in 2017, America's China policy rested on the essentially nonpartisan principles established during this period. Today, China has become a formidable economic and technological competitor to the United States. In the prevailing circumstances, the question is sometimes raised whether Nixon, were he alive today, would regret the opening to China. It is a challenge he anticipated. His July 1971 Kansas City speech betrays an acute awareness of China's potential to impact the international system. The very success of our policy of ending the isolation of mainland China will mean an immense escalation of their economic challenge, not only to us but to others in the world. 800 million Chinese, open to the world, with all the communication and the interchange of ideas that inevitably will occur as a result of that opening, will become an economic force in the world of enormous potential. British Prime Minister Palmerston famously said, "We have no eternal allies, and we have no perpetual enemies. Our interests are eternal and perpetual, and those interests it is our duty to follow." Building cooperation with China to counter the Soviet Union was an overriding American interest during the Cold War. Today, any U.S. policy toward China has to take place in the context of its vast economy, comparable to that of the United States, growing military power, and skill in diplomacy hewn in preserving thousands of years of distinctive culture. The opening to China, then, like every strategic success, was not only a response to contemporary problems but also an admissions ticket to future challenges. The most pronounced among them is this: as modern technology continues to compound the destructive capacity of nuclear war through the advent of a variety of high-tech weapons and radical improvements in artificial intelligence, China, Russia, and the U.S. have begun modernizing their military arsenals, with weapons developing the capability to seek their own targets and learn from experience, and cyber weapons that can obscure rapid determination of their origin. Establishing a permanent dialogue side by side with technological development is imperative to ensure the stability of world order, and perhaps the survival of human civilization. See further discussion in the conclusion. The Middle East in turmoil. A pair of issues, at once perennially linked and seemingly contradictory, confronted Nixon at the beginning of his presidency: how to maintain the West's position in the, mostly Arab, Middle East while also fulfilling America's commitment to the security of Israel. Like his predecessors, Nixon embraced both objectives, but he also began to pursue them from a new strategic perspective. The last year of the Johnson administration defined the shape of the Middle East crisis that Nixon would inherit. The 1967 war between Israel and its Arab neighbors, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, ended with Israel occupying the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, the Golan Heights from Syria, and the Palestinian West Bank from Jordan. These conquests transformed the bargaining position of the two sides. Israel would start a peace process, if it could be started at all, in possession of the tangible territorial prize, which it intended to use for intangible strategic aims, namely, recognition of its legitimacy and existence, as well as secure borders, which implied adjustment of the 1949 armistice lines. The UN sought to create an international framework for this process by means of Security Council Resolution 242. Adopted in 1967, it contained all of the sacramental words, peace, security, political independence, but in a sequence that drained them of operational significance by enabling each side to apply its own definitions. It read: the Security Council 1. Affirms that the fulfillment of UN Charter principles requires the establishment of a just and lasting peace in the Middle East, which should include the application of both the following principles. I. Withdrawal of Israel armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict. 2. Termination of all claims or states of belligerency and respect for and acknowledgement of the sovereignty, territorial integrity and political independence of every state in the area and their right to live in peace within secure and recognized boundaries free from threats or acts of force. The extent of the territories from which Israel was to withdraw was left ambiguous, as was the definition of a just and lasting peace, a condition that in a world of sovereign states has in any case proved difficult to sustain. As a consequence, each party interpreted the text against the background of its existing convictions. In March 1969, Egypt's President Nasser attempted to accelerate the process by shelling the Israeli positions along the Suez Canal with heavy artillery. Israel responded with deep penetration air raids against Egypt's interior. Nixon made a number of immediate decisions. He assigned negotiations on the Middle East to Secretary of State William Rogers, but simultaneously left it to me to bring about a sequence in which the Middle East diplomacy would come to a head only after our diplomatic efforts vis-a-vis Vietnam, so as to avoid simultaneous domestic controversy over two such different issues. Rogers' mediation efforts produced a UN-sponsored ceasefire agreement along the Suez Canal which established a 50-kilometer, 32-mile, wide demilitarized zone on each side of the canal. This was proposed by Rogers on June 19, 1970, and announced by him on August 7. Nasser and the Soviets violated it immediately by moving 50 Soviet-provided batteries of advanced anti-aircraft missiles into the demilitarized zone along the west bank of the canal. Military conflict along the canal thus seemed imminent, and a subgroup of the National Security Council concluded that Israel would be the most likely initiator of it. Nixon rejected this appraisal. He did not favor Israeli initiation of a conflict so far from its borders. Such an action, he argued, might trigger a confrontation with the Soviet Union or a wider conflict. A conflict along the Suez Canal involved American security interests. If necessary, American forces should be involved so as to produce maximum deterrence of the Soviet Union. He reserved the initiation of such action to himself and proscribed exploring it until he were to approve it. The issue then settled down for a few weeks until the center of gravity in the Middle East crisis shifted from the Suez Canal to the future of the Jordanian state. During this period, Nixon's quest for a comprehensive approach focused on diminishing the crucial role that Soviet military assistance had been playing in fostering radical Arab designs. In the daily morning discussions in Nixon's private White House office, we reasoned that Egypt and Syria would modify their pressures once they recognized that the U.S. was prepared to thwart Soviet assistance, which ranged from supplying MiG aircraft and heavy artillery to some 20,000 on-the-ground advisors of ground forces. As a complement to blocking that strategy and constricting anti-aircraft batteries, we planned to support serious negotiations for Middle East peace provided the Arab states would deal with Israel directly. Enthusiastic about this approach, Nixon urged me to begin referring to it publicly. Accordingly, I explained during a conversation with a journalist early in the Nixon administration, we are trying to expel the Soviet military presence, not so much the advisors, but the combat pilots and the combat personnel, before they become firmly established. The first test of the strategy came in September 1970, when the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, an anti-Israel terrorist group formed in Cairo in 1964, hijacked 4 Western passenger planes and landed 3 of them in Jordan. The fourth, which landed in Cairo, was blown up shortly after the passengers were released. With this action, which began the series of events which in the Arab world came to be called Black September, Palestinian terrorists stood on the verge of transforming sovereign Jordan into an operational base. King Hussein, the doughty monarch who had handled decades of hostility from Arab neighbors as well as Israel's security concerns, with diplomatic skill and courage, threw down the gauntlet. He closed the Palestinian refugee camps on Jordanian soil, which had become PLO bases, and evicted the residents mostly to Lebanon. Amidst rising tensions, Syrian and Iraqi armies began to concentrate forces on their frontiers with Jordan. A number of Washington Special Action Group, WSAG, meetings on our side followed. The WSAG was a flexible interagency group at the Deputy Secretary level which coordinated crisis management, under the chairmanship of the Security Advisor. We concluded that Hussein would not yield and that Israel would not tolerate a military attack on Jordan by its neighbors. When these views were brought to Nixon, he emphatically repeated his instructions from the Suez Crisis. Jordan needed to be preserved, but Israeli action to that effect should not be undertaken without U.S. approval, and U.S. military action could not take place or be specifically threatened without his consent. On September 18, a Syrian armored division crossed the Jordanian frontier and advanced on the town of Irbid. King Hussein resisted and asked for American support. The crisis had evolved into a direct strategic challenge. Were Jordan to disintegrate and Arab armies to appear on Israel's eastern frontier, a war could result that could bring Soviet forces into the region to support Soviet advisors already with the Syrian and Iraqi armed forces. Israeli military opposition was therefore probable, and American support for it, at least diplomatically, was essential. Crisis management sometimes produces incongruities. When, on a Sunday night, I brought news of the Syrian invasion of Jordan to Nixon, he was bowling in the basement of the Eisenhower Executive Office building, a very rare event. It was important to prevent the crisis in Jordan from escalating, but neither could we allow a Syrian occupation of strategic parts of Jordan, achieved with Soviet weapons and advisors, to become a fait accompli. When I put the issues to him, Nixon authorized initial steps to contain the crisis and reverse the Syrian adventure. In his presence, still in the bowling alley, I telephoned Yitzhak Rabin, then the Israeli ambassador to Washington, to inform him that we would not let the Syrian invasion stand. We would support a mobilization of Israeli forces to threaten the Syrian flank, but military action should wait on further discussions. I then called Secretary of State Rogers to inform him of the President's thinking. He replied that he was uneasy about military action but that he would ask Joe Sisko, the Assistant Secretary of State, to come to the Situation Room in the White House to help coordinate the diplomacy. Characteristically, Nixon was not prepared to manage a crisis in the White House in bowling clothes. He disappeared for a few minutes to change into a business suit to join Sisko and me in the Situation Room. Conventional diplomacy would suggest appealing to both parties for restraint and setting up some kind of diplomatic conference to settle outstanding issues. But in the existing circumstances, such moves would likely have accelerated the crisis by giving the aggressor time to extend its conquests. A call for an international conference before a Syrian withdrawal would have rewarded both the hijacking and the invasion. It would also have established a Syrian military presence deep in Jordanian territory. And rather than separating the Arab regimes from their Soviet backers, as our policy envisioned, such an action by the U.S. would likely have reinforced their dependence on Moscow. The larger the conference, the more difficult it is to achieve a consensus. The refusal to recognize Israel's right to exist had been embedded in Arab diplomacy since Israel's founding. While, for their part, most European countries supported Israel's legitimacy, they were opposed to its insistence on direct negotiations before a ceasefire. And even if all this were not the case, the pace of diplomacy would still have been inherently slower than the advance of Syrian armed forces with their Soviet advisors on the ground in Jordan. Therefore, Nixon decided in the Situation Room that any appeals for restraint from other countries be diverted to the Syrian invaders, and their Soviet sponsors in the first instance. We would insist on Syrian withdrawal from Jordan as a precondition to negotiations. Such a policy required some demonstration of U.S. commitment. Nixon therefore raised the alert level for U.S. forces in Europe by 1 notch.